So working with masculinity. So it's very important that we are aware of not just the wider social constructs, cultural constructs, but the individual experiences for that man. So we never want to assume. So this is my first point, is about clinicians' own bias and stereotypes. So key stereotypes could be, men of a certain age, behave in a certain way, or men from a certain culture. Maybe you have your own bias, your own stereotyping around what you think that looks like. But what we need to do is unpack that man's individual lived experience to identify what his constructs are of masculinity and his perceptions of what mental health means as a man. So we would be looking at things like social, cultural, and their lived experience. What has being a man been like for this individual? How was he, spoken to as a young child? How has he been taught to deal with his emotions? As we've said, this is not every man. But if we are working with a man with problematic or toxic masculinity, or difficulty expressing emotions, or any of those kind of things that we've identified as problematic, violence in relationships, things like that, these are the things we need to unpack. Another really, really helpful clinical avenue to go down is schema therapy. So when we're talking about schema therapy, it is the role, or that sort of construct that they have created. What is it that's gone into their sense of self, their perception of self? How do they view the world? How do they think other people are going to respond to them? And unpacking all of the different elements that come into it. So what are their cognitions about masculinity? What is their emotional awareness? So their internal, are they aware of their emotions and the different range and variety of emotions that they're experiencing? Fears about emotions. So do they have any kind of concerns, fears, worries, bias that's built up around particular emotions? Is it, is fear something that they're just not allowed to be feared because they're not allowed to feel fear because they've got to be strong? Or is it sadness because, crying is seen as weak? Do they have particular fears or particular emotions about emotions? It's getting very meta here, but this is really, really important to sort of pull apart. Behavioural patterns that are associated with GRC, so that gender role conflict, and their personal experience of gender role conflict. So what has this done? What have these messages done to this man? Like, how does it impact him in his life? What has it meant for him and his relationships and substance use and help seeking? How have these behaviors actually influenced this man in his life? And we also then explore the concept of cognitive dissonance. So that's a fancy word for a Sunday morning here in Perth. But it's essentially that tension when we have thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors, we have thoughts and beliefs, but our behaviors contradict those things. It results in immense tension and distress. And so you often have this internal push and pull when someone is impacted by toxic masculinity, because they have these internal needs to be supported and looked after, internal needs to, express sadness and be comforted. But then that sort of behavioral need of, what they need and what support is required versus their own internal values and perceptions of masculinity creates this huge distress and internal push-pull and, argument, because they need it, but they don't want to need it. But they need it, but they can't that can't ask for it. They can't deal with that. And so it's this really, really deep-seated internal distress. So when we are looking at a gendered approach towards working with our male clients, what we're not wanting to do is we're not wanting to reduce or redefine their masculinity. That is, it's very deep-seated. It is part of them, and you can't tear down, half of society being men or male. There's nothing wrong with that masculinity. There are many, many positives and strengths associated with certain male traits. So I can see it's very nicely aligned. I can see some beautiful comments starting to come through in the chat box about positive masculinity. You guys reached it much quicker than my slides were able to keep up. So I would love some self-reflection if you're watching this later, or maybe some sharing in the chat box. What are some certain male traits or positive masculinity that we can use to counterbalance some of the challenging or potentially more problematic? So you have things like working hard, being a hard worker, and being a provider. It can drive men in the same way that it can be toxic if they're pointing it in the right direction. You've got, yes, if you've got any comments about what you think positive masculinity could look like, absolutely share in the chat box, or reflect, within yourself. Being a protector, yeah, I love that. That doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. That can make them loving and nurturing and compassionate. It is pointed in the right direction. You've got strength, to be strong and to kind of persist and to keep driving. It can create huge reserves of resilience. That's absolutely an amazing thing. Resilience is a great protector, for mental health and against, depression and substance use and things like that. You do have all of these other really, really positive elements, and it's about finding those strengths. So you've got strengths-based, client-led practices where we actually dig those things out and we help them find. So we're not completely dismantling their constructs of masculinity, because that's not going to be helpful either. But what we are pulling from is how they can use certain perceptions as a strength, or how we can shift. Yeah, and I just saw a really lovely comment about, that provider role. If that's something that they're really, really drawn to and that really drives their personality, we don't want to create additional cognitive dissonance by saying, no, you can no longer be the provider. But how do we actually draw on that and show them how to engage in positive parenting and, looking after, nurturing, and how that is an element of being a provider, but possibly a much gentler one for everybody. So breaking down what it actually means to be these things or do these things, it is a really important part of that therapy. Is pulling out what are their constructs, what are the things that they have innately built into their personalities or into their value system, and reframe and shift. And another really, really massive one, and kind of the next biggest point, and kind of really sort of the final piece of the puzzle for when we're working with masculinity, toxic masculinity, is expanding emotional repertoire. So we've spoken about, suppression of emotions, being able to tolerate distress or how they respond to distress, help seeking. I'll come back to the example of that male client that I mentioned right back at the beginning. And when we were working together, we talked a lot about, it was broken right back to how I work with children. And this is not to infantilize that man, but the things that we were working on were things that I was working on or would be working on with children, because his emotional range was so depleted and so absent in many ways that we had to go right back to the start of, what does an emotion feel like in your body? How do you know that that is sadness versus anger? Where do you feel it? How does it feel? What sensations come with it? You know, what does surprise feel like? What does fear feel like? And actually learning to differentiate between those feelings, because his feelings were so wrapped up in anger. That's what was coming out. That's what he knew how to identify. And actually unpulling all of those things. And one day he said to me, he's like, I can't believe that's actually sadness, and that it's okay to be sad. When we unpacked that emotions are messages and they tell us important things and they get our needs met. And if you don't look at them, how can you get your needs met? And the emotion then dissipates once that need has been met. And it was such a huge moment for him. It sounds so simple when I'm saying it, but that was actually the massive turning point for this particular client, was that he understood that he had feelings and that his feelings meant something and that they were actually okay. So we need to teach our men how can they deal with particular emotions, give them distress tolerance strategies, give them emotional regulation strategies. Love that idea. Emotions cards, yeah, role play. We used to set up, like Jenga games for some teen males that I had worked with. Because if you play a game, it's much more amenable than sitting down and just talking at them. And on the back of the Jenga cards, you'd have one was coloured in red, one was yellow, and one was blue. And then you pull it out and you'd have to say, why might somebody feel, red? So anger. Why might somebody feel blue? Maybe that's sadness, whatever they interpret yellow to be. And finding other ways to sort of get them to accept and understand where different emotions come from, and then also how to express them in helpful and adaptive ways. So I guess the final point before we move to the Q&A portion of working with masculinity is, we've got our own biases and our own lived experience that is going to influence how we think about males and men and gender roles. So my perception as a female and what I've experienced as a female working with males or living in an environment where half of them are males will create a bias. And I know that we don't like to imagine ourselves as having biases, but we do. Everybody does. And if you ignore them, they actually become problematic. So let's try and skip our own biases by remaining professionally curious at all times, and instead of making assumptions about how we think this is certain interplay in this man's life has created this situation that has actually got him reaching out for help, or has somehow gotten you exposed to working with him. I did see that there was a mention of some mandated services. Sometimes men do come to us because they've been mandated to do so, and that can change the dynamic somewhat in terms of self-directed help seeking versus mandated help seeking. But unpacking what their experience of masculinity is, how that's influenced their context, and then looking for cognitive dissonance. So where are they experiencing that tension from that push and pull, that internal push and pull of what they need versus what's actually happening, and then working on that emotional repertoire.